Hello guys, and welcome along to our 5th year introductory free class into the Academy. So my name is Gavin. I'm one of the English teachers here in the Dublin Academy. I've been teaching here for the last 6 years, and I've been teaching Leaving Cert English for the last 12. So hopefully a lot of what I say today will make sense to you guys, and hopefully a lot of it you can kind of take on board and start to use now when you head back to school at the end of August into September. All right. What we're going to look at today is we're going to look at the guts of 17.5% for our entire Leaving Cert. So again, a lot of us coming from 4th year on into 5th year. A lot of us obviously haven't been in school since March and haven't been doing much since March. And again, some of us coming from 3rd year directly into 5th year as well. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and simplify things as best I can, and really try and make this kind of a stepping stone to go back into August and then on into September. What I also want to try and do is show you, I suppose, how we try and teach things here in the Academy, how we ultimately try and work smarter and not harder. Okay, so even if you're kind of taking 20 or 30% away from today's class, that's really good going, again, because I'm going to be talking fast, and again, a lot of us aren't probably used to this kind of setup as well, especially if we're only starting in 5th year as well. All right, so guys, this is how the classes work. Effectively, if you're looking to try and join the grinds, or maybe even some of us looking to join the day school here in the Academy, with how the grind classes work, we'll have a column. We typically have 3 working boards within the classroom, and we'll have a column basically written out at the start of every class about what we intend to cover, and then we tend to have 2 or 3 working boards then on top of that. All right. We also have a vocab column, which we'll talk about as we go on today. So in terms of our plan today, as I said, my name is Gavin. Again, I'm teaching 5th year and 6th year grinds here in the school over kind of 2 evenings and Saturday classes as well. So as I said, if you kind of like what you see and you kind of think that I'm definitely a guy that could help you get out of the pitfall that is the most common grade in English at the minute, guys, in terms of the country, is a H4, and the second most common grade is a H5. So if you're sitting down to this class and you kind of think, you know what, and you're starting off in 5th year and you're kind of mapped out your CAO points already, you've had a little consideration about what course you want to take on, and you kind of think, you know what, I probably need a H1 or H2 in English, just be mindful that those are the most common grades in the country. So it might be a case that you just need that extra little bit, that extra kind of 10 to 12% that students tend to take away from these classes. Okay, so that's who I am, teaching 5th year English. And today, as I said, in terms of today's class, we will be looking at certainly the beginnings of 17.5%. All right, that is how much poetry is going for in terms of your Leaving Cert. This is something I work on heavily within my classes in terms of grind and day school classes. It's very important that you as students understand the percentage breakdown, how much percent is going for each individual topic. Okay, that's very important. It's more important not only for English, it's important across the board as well. All right, where this 17.5% comes from is unseen poetry, which is 5%, and we'll spend a good chunk of time making sure that we can almost box this off today. Okay, I will be delighted, and hopefully I would say the majority of you guys will walk away from today's video lesson, this free video lesson, with 5% of your grade, or certainly the tools with which to garner that 5%. Okay. The other thing that we're going to look at and probably get on to towards the end of today's class is our studied poetry, okay, which is 12.5% of our grade. 50 marks going for our studied poetry. Again, 2 areas, guys, that hold a huge amount of fear and trepidation for a lot of 5th year students and even 6th year students. And we're going to try and best, I suppose, today to alleviate that fear and try and show you again the simple tips and tricks that we can implement or start to implement in order to maximize our grade. Okay? We will be looking at a very complex, arguably one of the more difficult poets in terms of the course. We'll be looking at Dickinson towards the end of today's video class. And the reason why I've selected Dickinson is because, one, there's a very good chance of her being on your paper in terms of when you sit down in 6th year, in terms of June next year, when you sit down to your Leaving Cert. Something we do here in the school is we do work on predictions, and we do kind of, look at, the potential poets that we feel are going to be on the paper. And thankfully, over the last number of years, we've been incredibly successful at that. But the reason also, second reason why we're going to look at Dickinson today is to show you one of the more difficult, one of the more complex poets, and how we can simplify things, how we can really break down her poetry and poets' work, and show you again essentially what you need to take away from studied poetry, okay, and the studied poems, okay? That's something we're going to look at. Where we're going to start in today's class, guys, is we're going to look at what's called this, I suppose, fortunate or unfortunate kind of acronym here, PISS, and we're going to talk about what that's made up of and essentially why we use this as an acronym to dissect our aesthetic language, why we use it to dissect our poetry. We're going to look at structure. We'll talk a little bit about exemplar material and I suppose our sample essays, etc., and that's how we'll go through today's class. All right, so guys, that's normally what we work off. This is the column that we focus on, and again excuse me, this is effectively how the grinds work. All right, in terms of where we start, so we all have kind of our notes in front of us. We either have them in front of us in terms of a second screen opened, in terms of the PDF that we have there. Ideally, if we were to have it downloaded and printed out, we could highlight it and kind of jot down a couple of little points as we go as well. If you don't have it in, I suppose, a tangible copy in front of you, make sure you have an A4 pad beside the laptop and that you can take down a couple of little points as well. All right. Before we get into the notes, before we get into the 5th year unseen poem on Emily Dickinson, what we are essentially looking at today, guys, is part of what's described as our categories of language. Okay, now not to kind of bounce between a number of different papers in terms of paper 1 and paper 2, because obviously what we're focusing on today is paper 2 material, is our studied material, both unseen and studied. But effectively what this is, guys, is these are our 5 categories of language. Now, if it's a case that you don't go through these in your day school in the entirety of 5th year, well, that's really, I suppose, a failing in terms of what's going on in your class. You need to know your categories of language. You need to know how formulaic and how structured English is, okay? These are our 5 categories of language. Obviously, very, very important for paper 1 material, because you're going to be identifying and using these 5 categories of language for that 50%. But also then for your paper 2 material. Effectively what we're focusing on is on this A here, which is aesthetic language. Okay, now aesthetic language is where poetry falls under. The 5 categories here, guys, are argument, persuasion, aesthetic, informative, and narrative. All right, those are our 5 categories of language which we need to become familiar with as we go on through 5th year. It's something we focus on heavily in the grinds, because for whatever reason, in other day schools, they don't tend to focus on paper 1 material. They don't do a lot on essay writing and your question A material, question B material, for whatever reason. Let's not forget that that's 50% of our grade, and it's 50%, guys, that are incredibly achievable, okay, as long as you have your categories of language. All right, the language we're focusing on, or this category, is aesthetic language. If it looks good and it sounds good, we classify it as aesthetic language, okay? You'll also need to define each one of these categories, because again, you're going to use the definitions within a poetry answer, unseen or studied. And aesthetic language, guys, is effectively defined as a type of language that provokes or evokes a response from the reader, all right? Which means if you talk about the impact that this language had on you, the impact that the poem had on you, be it unseen or studied, the impact that Othello or your single text had on you, then you get heavily rewarded for that. Especially when it comes to unseen poetry. Something we're going to talk about a little bit later on today is timing, time management, and then paper, I suppose, in terms of our paper management as well. We really have a very short amount of time to take on our unseen poetry. We have 22 to 25 minutes to take it on. So the examiners in the department are not effectively monsters. Like, we want you to do well. And one way you'll do incredibly well is responding with this kind of concept of impact, all right? What impact the poem had on you. And that'll be you responding to the poem with regards to your thoughts and your feelings. If we go with synonyms there, guys, your opinions and the emotion that this poem or again this poet conjured up within you, okay? That is arguably, guys, I'll put a little star beside this here, that is arguably the most important word for your entire English Leaving Cert, both paper 1 and paper 2. Not only are you going to use this for poetry, you're going to talk about the Shakespearean text and the impact that it had on you. You're going to talk about the myriad of different texts you're going to look at with regards to your comparative subject, your comparative task, and again, how the the play, the novel, and the film, how that impacted upon you, okay? Especially for our unseen poetry, to go back to that, you don't have time to get a full understanding. You don't have time to dissect the poem within an inch of its life. So what you need to do is, on my initial reading, I felt this. The first time I looked at this poem, my interpretation was X. Or I really felt that there was a strong juxtaposition from stanza 1 to stanza 2. These are the types of statements and responses that, again, examiners will be looking for from you as a fifth year student and then on into sixth year, okay? So it's all about impact, guys, responding to that aesthetic language, okay? Guys, aesthetic language effectively is, I suppose, made up of these 4 components here. All right, and this is why we have our kind of fortunate or unfortunate, or kind of our pseudo bad word, kind of PISS there in terms of our acronym. It's made up of pattern, imagery, sensuousness, and suggestiveness. Now, the reason why we use those 4 words and those 4 terms is, as I've said, that's what makes up aesthetic language. But if I could direct you to the notes here, and if we have a quick look at page 3 of the notes, okay, as I said, whether you have it in terms of the digital version or your actual tangible version, it doesn't really matter massively. On page 3, though, we have a little bit of an insight as to why we use these 4 terms, okay? First off, you have a couple of statements there that are written in italics or printed in italics for you. Students should be able to read poetry conscious of a specific mode of using language as an artistic medium. Both of these statements, guys, coming from the department marketing schemes, things that are given to teacher, the dossier given to teacher in order to take on candidates leaving cert scripts. That first statement there, guys, is just making sure, do you as candidates understand what aesthetic language is and your ability to dissect the information under this artistic medium, okay? Recognizing that that's the category of language you're focusing on. The second statement, which I would argue is I suppose, more important than the first. It says reward candidates' awareness of the pattern nature of language. We put a little #1 in there. It's imagery, #2. It's sensuous qualities, number 3. And then it's suggestiveness, number 4. Okay? So the point I'm making is these 4 terms are down in the department marking scheme. This is what examiners are told to look out for when they're correcting your scripts. So you guys would be crazy not to respond under this guise. Not only that, is you'd be crazy not to use this actual vernacular as well, this actual vocab. And guys, as well, to go one step further, in terms of optics, you'll hear me talk about this a lot in today's class. And then again, for those of you I see in the grinds as well, you'll hear me constantly talk about optics. Okay, use it in topic sentences at the beginning of paragraphs, really putting your best foot forward, playing to your strengths, and again, playing the game a little bit, all right? So rather than responding with, I really like the imagery in this poem because it was nice, rather than that, you respond with the sensuous qualities contained within stanza 1 really spoke to me, or I gravitated towards the pattern nature of this poem. If that's used, if those types of statements, again, impact, plus this vocabulary, if those types of statements are used early on in a response, early on in a paragraph, it makes examiners' lives incredibly easy. So we'll think about optics and we'll think about all that as we go forward, okay? Effectively, if you have a little look on page 3 there, we're just dissecting what does this essentially mean about poetry, both studied and unseen. And if you have a little look there, so it says, to get a good grade in Leaving Cert Poetry and Leaving Cert English, you need to be able to read and quote from the poetry. And if we look at that in terms of unseen poetry, there really is no excuse because you have the poem there in front of you. What is important though, and we'll talk about this as well, about understanding, the next bullet point there, guys, is understanding what the poetry is about, okay? Those 2 bullet points you can almost take together. It's very important that you quote from the poem. Let's look at unseen for a second. But then you also qualify why you're using a particular quote, all right? It's incredibly jarring, it's incredibly off-putting in terms of grades now at this stage, that if a candidate writes something, an incredible response, heavy with impact, really good use of vocab, and then the quote that they attached in order to back up their point isn't the quote that's applicable at that time, all right? It's incredibly jarring, and it's one of the reasons why that H4, H5 is the most common grade in the country, that students really struggle to qualify their responses. So make sure that we're using applicable quotes in order to back up what we're saying, okay? So that's read and quote from the poetry. When we look at studied poetry, for example, if we're kind of bouncing between studied and unseen, when we are looking at studied poetry, effectively you need to have 8 to 10 reference points per poem, All right, something we'll talk about a little bit later as well. You need 6 poems per poet. You guys starting 5th year now, you're in a different position to other, say, 6th years that I've been speaking to. Make sure, regardless of what you're told in your day school, you need 6 poems per poet. If you're looking to try and get out of that black hole that is the H4 and H5, and you want to get into H3 and then above into H2 and H1, make sure you're learning 6 poems per poet. And even if you're struggling with that, make sure you have 5 really well understood and that you can mention a 6th, that you can bring in a 6th and some sort of a reference point. And not only that, make sure you have 8 to 10 reference points per poem as well. Make sure each one of those reference points is what we describe as here in the academy as malleable. All right, and malleable, guys, in terms of, I should have probably put that in the vocab section in order to stick as close to the grinds as possible here. Make sure that the quotes that you elect to learn are malleable, are interchangeable, that they are useful or applicable for a number of different questions. All right, that goes for your Shakespearean text as well, guys. It goes for your comparative as well also. That the quotes you elect to learn, because there's a fair bit of learning involved with regards to certainly paper 2 material. Make sure we work smarter, not harder, essentially the mantra here in my classes, okay? So we're reading and quoting from poetry, both unseen and studied. We're understanding what the poetry is about. Now, in terms of studied poetry, that's very, very important. You need to know the theme and the message behind each individual poem. We'll talk about that a little bit later on when we get on to studied poetry. In terms of our unseen poetry, guys, you know, it's a case that you might look at an unseen poem, it comes up in your Leaving Cert again in June 2022, and you really struggle with identifying what the message is and even understanding the poem. Well, then make sure you fall back heavily on your thoughts and your feelings. Because as I said, and we'll look at in terms of timing, you only have about 4 to 6 minutes to dissect the poem. The examiners are not monsters. They want you to do well. So if it's a case that you really miss the meaning, you have to go strong with what your opinion is, what your interpretation is, and then qualify that and back that up in terms of the points that you want to make, okay? If you back up the point that you're saying, you have to get rewarded for it. Even if you miss the mark, you will still get heavily rewarded for that, okay? Just on that, with regards to impact as well, again, it's all about like interpretation. So making statements, again, as I mentioned before, you know, in terms of it was my interpretation of, or my understanding was this, and then as I said, you qualify that as well. With regards to our studied poetry, on the other hand, you will have to know the theme. We will dissect, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, dissecting all our poems under the concept of the 3 T's: theme, tone, and technique. Okay, and that's something that will highlight or kind of reveal almost the theme to us. Okay, that's understanding what the poetry is about. And finally there, express your opinion and how well the poet expressed their thoughts through the language that they used. And guys, that just goes back to impact again. So you can see now and start to see certainly how, I suppose, significant this information becomes. All right. If you need to have a little pause of the screen there, do so now, just again so that we know about defining aesthetic language and making sure that we understand how significant aesthetic language is. If not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start walking us through the idea of and the ideas and the concepts behind pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness, okay?